The wind didn't howl that morning. It whispered. Soft across the plains, threading through the skeletons of grass and brittle sage, brushing past a pair of torn shoes half buried in snow. In the wide, frozen belly of the valley, two figures knelt like offerings, tied to splintered posts driven into the railroad bed, backs upright only because the ropes held them so. The snow had swallowed their shadows. Time moved around them, indifferent. And the train, still a ghost in the far distance, kept coming. She was 25, though her body bore more years than she'd lived. The fabric of her dress, what was left of it, clung damp to her knees. Her hands, bound behind her, trembled from more than cold. Her lips were split, chapped from wind and silence. But her spine did not bow. Even with her breath catching in clouds before her face. Even with her belly swollen beneath her bodice, round with child. Beside her, the older woman had stopped shivering. Head bowed. Eyes barely open. She was further along, maybe weeks from birth. But her silence spoke of something deeper than exhaustion. A resignation. The kind that sets in when a person knows they've been thrown away like trash and no one's coming back to look. There'd been no trial. No warning. Just one winter morning, rough hands, bitter voices, a wagon ride without destination. And then this, the bitter edge of the tracks, ropes cut into wrists, and the order to sit still. The men didn't say what time the train was coming. Only that it was. And that no one would stop it. She hadn't screamed. She saved her breath for the baby. But hours passed. Long enough for the sun to rise and harden into something sharp overhead. Long enough for the snow to stop falling. And in that space between hopelessness and numbness, when she had closed her eyes and thought of water, she heard something that didn't belong. Hooves. Slow. Cautious. Not from the town. Not the men returning. A single rider. She forced her eyes open. Squinted against the light. And there he was. A lone horseman, dark coat dusted with frost, wide-brimmed hat pulled low. His horse looked nearly as tired as she felt, steam rising from its flanks, breath fogging with each step. The man sat tall, but not proud. He didn't charge. Didn't speak. He just looked, long and deep, as though he couldn't quite believe what he saw. Two women. Roped like cattle. Faces bruised. Bellies full. She blinked slowly, waiting to vanish. But he didn't disappear. Nor did he ride past. Instead, he dismounted. Boots pressing into the crusted snow with the weight of someone who knew pain. He walked up beside her, not rushing, not loud. He knelt, close, but not touching, and looked into her eyes. His face was weathered, quiet. Somewhere in his 40s. A beard flecked with gray. Eyes like still water. Not the color, but the calm. Like he'd seen every kind of storm, and now stood after them, unsure what still mattered. She didn't say a word. Couldn't. But something in her gaze must have asked for mercy. He didn't ask questions. He didn't shout for help. He simply reached for the knife at his belt and cut the ropes with steady hands. Her arms dropped to her sides, lifeless for a moment, before instinct made her catch herself. Pain bloomed across her shoulders. But freedom, even painful, was a mercy no one had offered her in a long while. The other woman moaned faintly. Still breathing. He moved to her next, worked slower. Her skin was gray at the edges. He touched her wrist. A pulse, barely. He stood again, looking back toward the eastern ridge. The whistle of the train now called faintly, too far to be urgent, too close to be ignored. He looked at the girl. She saw it in his eyes, the weight of decision. Two women. One horse. A steep hill to climb. She didn't beg. Didn't plead. Only said, voice raw as wind. She's not gonna make it alone. He nodded once, just once, and reached into his saddlebag. Pulled out a thick blanket, a rope, and a broken sled he'd strapped to the horse earlier in the week, meant for hauling firewood. Now it would haul lives. He wrapped the older woman carefully, like someone who'd done this before. Lifted her with a grunt and a whispered apology to the sky, then placed her on the sled, tying her in gently so she wouldn't fall. Then he turned back to her, the younger one. His gaze didn't linger. Didn't slide over her the way other men's had. He saw the bruises. The belly. The dirt. And none of it changed the way he reached down, offering his hand as if he were greeting someone on church steps. She hesitated. Then took it. Her legs nearly buckled when she stood, numb and stiff. He caught her by the elbow, guiding her to the saddle. She climbed up without grace, but without shame either. Shame had left her long ago. Maybe at the same place her name had been forgotten. He led the horse on foot, reins in one hand, sled rope in the other. Each step careful, deliberate. The wind picked up. The train's whistle now clearer, closer. They crossed the snowy plain, not as survivors, not yet as companions, but as people bound by something quieter, a moment of grace in a world that rarely offered it. She looked down at him from the saddle, the swell of her belly pressed against the horn. He didn't look back. His eyes were on the trail, and on the fading sun, and on the weight of what he had just chosen. But her gaze stayed fixed on him. Not because he was a hero. Not because he was strong. But because he didn't ask who she was. He just saw her. And that was enough. By the time they reached the edge of the wooded ridge, the train had roared past the empty place where she once knelt. The snow was already covering the ropes. The wind erased the tracks. No one would know they'd ever been there. Except him. And her. And maybe, the child she carried. And as dusk began to fall, soft and blue over the hills, she leaned forward, voice barely more than breath. "You didn't ask me anything." He paused, eyes still forward. "I will," he said. "When you're ready." And in that quiet, in that gentleness, in that steady refusal to press, she felt something break and heal all at once. A kindness like that, she thought, was rarer than survival. And far harder to forget. The wind didn't howl that night either. It sang. Snow had softened by the time they reached the cabin, but the cold still bit like old grief, slow and steady, never in a hurry to let go. The cabin stood tucked into the crook of a hill, shielded by tall pine and rock. It wasn't much, just 4 walls, a slanted roof patched with bark, and a door that sighed louder than it opened. But smoke puffed gently from the chimney, and the wind didn't whistle through the cracks the way it had back on the plains. He led the horse into the lean-to beside the cabin, whispered thanks into its ear, then turned back to the sled. The older woman had faded during the ride, slipping in and out of whatever space lies between fever and surrender. Her lips were blue. She hadn't spoken a word. Inside, the fire was already burning low. He stoked it higher with thick pine logs, filling the room with that deep, resin-heavy warmth that smells like safety to those who haven't known it. The girl helped without being asked. She peeled off her wet shawl, hung it near the hearth, and knelt to gather snow in a pot for water. Her movements were slow, precise, not because she was weak, but because she'd learned that rushing led to mistakes. And mistakes cost too much. He brought the older woman in, arms trembling beneath her weight. Laid her gently on the cot by the window, covered her with every blanket he owned. Then he stepped back, stood with his hands on his hips, staring down like a man who'd built the fire but didn't know how to stop the cold. The girl didn't speak much that first night. She kept near the wall, hands over her belly, watching the older woman breathe with shallow, rattling gulps. When the kettle finally hissed, she made tea the way she'd been taught in a different life, steeping dried chamomile from a pouch she'd kept hidden in her skirt lining. He noticed, but didn't ask. When he handed her a bowl of soup, she took it with both hands, nodded once. Their eyes met briefly. A flicker of something passed between them, not gratitude, not yet trust. Just recognition. He didn't speak unless he had to. And when he did, it was with careful slowness, like he was tasting the shape of the words before letting them go. She liked that. Too many men filled silence like it was something broken that needed fixing. This one let it breathe. The older woman didn't improve. By the second night, her color had gone pale as parchment. She stopped responding to touch. Her hands curled tight at her chest, like she was still protecting something inside her even as everything else slipped away. The girl sat by her side through the night, humming old songs without melody, just sounds made from habit. The cowboy watched from the far chair, boots crossed, coat draped over his lap. Sometime before dawn, the woman stirred. Her eyes opened. Just barely. She looked at the girl, lips moving, voice too faint to carry. The girl leaned close. "You deserve to be seen," the woman whispered. Then she exhaled. One long, soft breath. And didn't take another. The girl didn't cry at first. She just sat there, holding the woman's hand long after it had grown still. The fire popped once. Somewhere outside, an owl called. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve and looked over at the cowboy, whose gaze never left her. "She was the only one who believed me when I said it wasn't my fault." He nodded slowly. Didn't ask for details. Just let the weight of her words settle into the floorboards. By morning, the sun had cracked through the cloud cover. Pale light spilled across the table where she now sat, peeling potatoes with deliberate care. Her hands moved like memory, like she wasn't quite here, but not gone either. He dug a shallow grave near the tree line. Wrapped the woman in a clean sheet. Let the girl say goodbye in private. They didn't pray over the grave. Neither of them said much. The snow fell gently during the burial, and afterward, the two stood side by side, eyes fixed on the fresh mound of earth. "She was a midwife," the girl said, her voice barely more than breath. "Helped birth half the children in our county. And they left her out there like she was nothing." He looked down, jaw tightening. "Folks can be cruel," he said. "Especially when they don't understand what they're looking at." She nodded. She understood too well. They didn't speak of the dead woman again. Not because they didn't care. But because grief, when fresh, doesn't like company. Days passed. The girl stayed. The man didn't tell her she could, but also didn't say she couldn't. The world outside remained frozen, but inside the cabin, warmth grew slowly. She began to tend the fire on her own. Swept the corners. Found jars of beans and dried peaches in the cellar and set them out like offerings. She moved like someone trying not to impose, but everything she touched stayed a little longer in place. The cabin began to feel like something lived in again, not just endured. One evening, he found her reading from an old journal by candlelight. His journal. The one with cracked leather and entries scrawled in a hand that grew more careful the more she turned the pages. "I'm sorry," she said, when she saw him. "I didn't know it was yours." He shrugged. Sat down across from her. "Doesn't matter. I was just trying to remember who I used to be." She nodded and didn't ask more. That night, for the first time, she asked his name. He gave it. Quietly. Then asked hers. She hesitated. Then gave only half of it. That was enough. The days settled into rhythm. He chopped wood. She cooked. They didn't talk much. But every once in a while, a sentence bloomed between them like a flower through frost. One night, as the wind pressed hard against the windows, she spoke aloud as they sat near the fire. "I was married," she said. "Barely 16. He was good at first. Then he wasn't. Then he died in a mine shaft 2 years ago. I stayed because I had nowhere else to go. And his father said I was worthless if I couldn't carry a child soon enough." She paused. Stirred the stew slowly. Then continued. "Took 3 years. Then this happened." She laid her hand over her belly. "He said I was cursed. Said it wasn't his son's seed but some devil's. Said I'd bring ruin to their name." Her voice broke then, just slightly. "So they tied me there." He didn't flinch. He didn't rush in with comfort or outrage. He just breathed in slowly, then said. "Then they were fools." She didn't speak again that night. But she slept easier than before. One afternoon, she found him sanding a piece of cedar by the porch. She asked what he was building. He said nothing. Just handed her a thin strip of wood, smelled like smoke and sap. "A cradle," he said eventually. "My hands remember." She held the wood like it was made of glass. "Did you have a child?" He nodded once. Briefly. And that was all. Something in the air shifted after that. Not like romance, not the heated kind. But something gentler. Like trust learning how to walk. She began to sit beside him in the evenings, both of them quiet, watching the flames. Her hand would drift to her stomach. His eyes would follow, then look away, not with shame, but reverence. One night, as snow whispered against the windows again, she looked at the cradle where it now stood finished in the corner, simple, but strong. She turned to him and said, "You built that without knowing if we'd stay." He looked at her, long and quiet. "I didn't build it for staying," he said. "I built it because someone should." Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Not until later, alone in the dark, hand on her belly, whispering a name that had never been spoken aloud before. It wasn't the name of a man. Or of the baby. It was her own. Spoken softly. As if reclaiming it. And outside, the snow continued to fall, not cruel, not punishing. Just snow. Quiet and honest. Like the man who saved her. Like the world, perhaps, beginning again. Winter did not leave in a single breath. It lingered, stubborn and slow, as though reluctant to loosen its grip on the valley. The snow began to melt only in quiet corners, thin rivulets tracing down the hills, weeping into frozen soil, softening the earth grain by grain. In the cabin, the thaw came just as gently. Not with declarations, not with fireworks. Only with warmer mornings, slower silences, and the comfort of shared routines. She began rising earlier, sometimes before the sun, moving through the small kitchen like she belonged to it. Her belly had grown round and firm, taut beneath the seams of the dress she'd let out twice now. She walked carefully, not from fear, but with reverence for the life blooming inside her. He noticed, always. But never with hunger or pity. Just a kind of stillness, like watching a rare flower open one petal at a time. The mornings smelled of coffee and pine. He'd returned from chopping wood to find the hearth warm, her hands busy, and 2 tin cups already waiting near the window. They didn't speak at first, didn't need to. The rhythm of coexistence had become music. One morning, as the wind softened and birds began returning to the treetops, he brought in a bundle of saplings and set them near the porch. "I'll plant a fence before summer," he said, more to the air than to her. "Keep out the strays." She nodded, brushing flour from her fingers. "Think we'll still be here come summer?" He looked at her. Not the question. Her. "I'd like you to be." No smile. No rush of warmth. But her breath caught just slightly, and she turned away too late to hide it. That day, while he fixed the roof from last month's snow weight, she sat beneath the eaves mending socks. The rhythm of the needle steadied her. The clouds drifted slow and thin above them. A robin landed on the woodpile and sang 3 clear notes. Without thinking, she said, "My name is Alma." It slipped out easy, as if she were remembering it herself. He looked down at her from the roof, nodded once. "That's a good name." It felt like she'd gifted him something holy. They spent a week like that, fence posts, warm meals, quiet smiles. But a shadow always lingered, faint and unspoken, the world outside. What it remembered. What it might come calling for. One night, as the fire snapped low and the wind pressed gently at the walls, she told him the rest. They sat side by side on the floor, knees nearly touching, mugs cooling between their hands. "My husband, he wasn't cruel at first," she said. "He was just tired. Worn out before his bones even grew strong." He didn't speak. Just watched her in the firelight. He drank because his father drank. Worked because his father said to. And when the mine took him, I think it was more relief than tragedy to them. One less mouth to question. One less burden. Her voice didn't tremble. "Not anymore. When I didn't bear a child, they said God had cursed me. That I was barren. That I'd ruined their line. And when I finally did get with child, they told me it was too late. That the shame had already settled." She took a breath. Set the mug aside. "So they took me out before dawn. Said it was a ride. Said we'd see the river bloom in ice. And then, the tracks." He set his mug down too. Looked at her like a man who'd seen pieces of his own grief in someone else's story. "They left you for dead," he said softly. "They thought I already was." The silence after was not empty. It was full, of truth, of sorrow, of something deeper than sympathy. He reached across the space and took her hand. Gently. Without claim. Without pressure. She didn't pull away. That night, she slept without nightmares. Spring unfolded slowly. The snow withdrew from the trees, revealing old stones and forgotten paths. Shoots of green pushed from the thawed earth. The stream by the hill began to murmur again. The valley had survived. So had she. The cradle he built stood by her bedside now, waiting. She ran her fingers along its edges each night, as though reassuring it that life would soon fill its emptiness. One evening, she brought him a cloth bundle. Inside were soft strips of worn flannel, shaped into tiny garments. Baby clothes. She had stitched them by candlelight, alone, humming broken lullabies. "These were from scraps," she said. "From the woman who passed. She had them tucked in her bag. Maybe for me. Maybe for no one." He held one of the pieces. Nodded. "Soft," he said. She looked at him then, long and sure. "I want to stay," she whispered. "If you still want me." He didn't answer right away. Just stepped closer, slowly, as if not to startle something sacred. "I've wanted that," he said, "since the first time you said nothing." The next day, word came by way of a traveler, an old man who traded tools and stories. He'd passed through a settlement 2 towns west. Heard talk of a family searching for a missing woman. Talk of men asking pointed questions. Offering coins. Descriptions too detailed to be guessed. She stood by the window after hearing it, arms folded over her belly, eyes on the ridgeline. "I knew they'd come," she said. He stood behind her. "You're not alone now." "I know." But her jaw was tight. Her breath slow. She wasn't afraid. Just tired of being chased. That night, she wrote a letter. She didn't say to whom. Folded it, tied it with twine, and left it inside the cradle. A piece of her story, written in her own hand, should the child ever need to know. The air that night carried the scent of rain. The birds quieted early. Even the fire burned low, as if conserving strength for what was to come. She sat beside him, shoulders brushing, both staring into the flames. "If they come," she said softly, "I won't run." "You don't have to," he replied. She turned to him, eyes glistening but fierce. "I'm not broken," she said. "No," he answered. "You're brave." And she believed him. Not because he said it, but because she'd lived through enough to recognize truth when it sat beside her in the quiet. In the morning, thunder would roll over the hills. Hooves would find old trails. And names from the past would try to carve their way into the present. But tonight was still. And sacred. And full of something no man could steal. Hope. And outside, the snow was gone. Only earth remained. Waiting to grow something new. The first storm of spring rolled in without apology. The sky turned the color of coal-washed linen, and rain began to fall in steady, deliberate drops, thick enough to carve rivulets into the soil, soft enough to sound like whispers on the roof. The wind stirred slowly through the trees, dragging old leaves from their rest. Inside the cabin, the fire snapped gently. The cradle beside the bed waited, empty still, but not for long. She stood by the window, one hand at the base of her belly, breathing through a low ache that had begun sometime before dawn. It wasn't sharp, not yet. Just steady. A quiet signal that the child was preparing its own way into the world. He sat at the table, oiling the hinges of the door again, though it hadn't squeaked in days. His eyes kept drifting to her, to the rise and fall of her breath, to the storm pressing down over the hills like a warning in the clouds. Something was coming. Not just the child. Something darker. Something from the past. The knock came just before noon, sharp, hard, and without hesitation. He stood slowly, wiped his hands on a cloth, and moved toward the door with a calm that betrayed how tightly his chest had drawn. She didn't move. Only turned slightly, watching with the stillness of someone who already knew what she'd see. 3 men stood outside, rain dripping from the brims of their hats, coats dark and soaked through. One held a rifle. The other 2 wore expressions like carved wood, tight, unbending, and cold. Behind them stood a mule and a wagon, half covered, wheels deep in mud. "You him?" the tallest asked. "The one keepin' what don't belong to you." The cowboy looked at each face, then to the horizon behind them. No lawmen in sight. No neighbors. Just him and them. Just the cabin and the storm. "She belongs to no one," he said. The man stepped forward. Not much. Just enough to show he wasn't afraid. "She's my brother's widow. Carried his name, and now carries his blood. That child's our blood. You can't claim it." The rain ran down the back of the cowboy's neck, but he didn't flinch. The woman behind him stepped forward, her voice low but steady. "You left me to die." The man's eyes narrowed. "You should have stayed dead." He moved, fast, hand to the rifle, but the cowboy was quicker. Not with a gun, but with his voice. "You'll think real hard before you fire anything near a pregnant woman." The words landed like lead. Not shouted. Just true. The tension thickened, dragging seconds into minutes. Thunder rumbled low, like the earth itself was listening. Then the second man, younger, thinner, with something skittish in his shoulders, spoke. "We don't want blood. Just what's owed. The child belongs to the family. Ain't personal." She stepped past the cowboy then, standing in the doorway. Her dress clung to her legs, soaked at the hem. Her face was calm. "I buried your child's aunt. She died in my arms. She believed this child deserved a name free of chains." The youngest man looked down. The tall one sneered. "You talk pretty for a thief." The cowboy stepped forward. Now the rain hit his boots full. He didn't raise his hands. Didn't draw a weapon. "You want to take a woman near her time, drag her through mud and cold, into a life that already tried to end her once. You want to raise a child with fear in his bones. You do that, you're worse than dead men." The older man took another step. Raised the rifle halfway. His lip curled. "You don't tell us who we are." The next sound wasn't thunder, it was the unmistakable click of a hammer pulled back. But not from his hands. From the woman's. She stood behind the cowboy now, holding his rifle with both hands. Not shaking. "I may be many things," she said. "But I am not yours." For a second, all sound ceased. Even the rain seemed to pause, listening. Then the third man, thin, eyes darting, stepped back. "We ain't dyin' here," he muttered. "Let it go." The tall one turned on him. "You coward." But the other man had already climbed back onto the wagon seat, whipping the mule forward. The tall man's jaw clenched, eyes flicking between the barrel of the rifle and the unshaken woman holding it. "You won't last," he hissed. She lowered the rifle. "Just a little. Then pray we do. Because we'll be the ones who remember." He turned. Spat into the mud. Walked back without another word. The wagon rolled away slowly, wheels grating through soaked earth, until the silhouettes vanished over the rise. The storm didn't end right away. But it no longer felt like a threat. Just a cleansing. She leaned against the doorframe, breath trembling, the pain in her belly rising now in sharp intervals. The cowboy was at her side before she could speak. "It's time," she whispered. He helped her inside, his hands steady even as the storm inside the cabin swelled to match the one outside. Boiled water. Gathered cloth. Spoke to her in short, calming phrases, like someone who'd been through fire and learned to respect its power. Hours passed. Darkness fell again. Rain continued to fall in sheets. But inside the cabin, something was breaking open, something beyond pain, beyond fear. She cried out once, sharp and primal, and then the sound shifted, turned to a gasp, to a sob, to a laugh all tangled into one. And then, the cry of new life. A child, red and perfect and screaming, filled the space with a voice that had never known silence. He held the babe with both hands, breath caught, tears in his beard, reverence etched in the bend of his fingers. She looked up at him from the bed, her hair damp, her eyes wide with exhaustion and wonder. "Boy?" she asked. He nodded. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He's free." He nodded again. Looked down at the boy. "No. He's home." The storm slowed sometime before dawn. The sky lightened. Rain eased to a mist. He built the fire higher. laid the baby in the cradle, and sat beside her, their hands entwined in silence. They didn't speak of the men again. Not that day. Not the one after. They had no place in this new world they were making. The earth had been softened by storm. But now it was ready to grow. And as the morning light filtered through the window, touching the child's face, the woman looked out into the clearing and said softly, "This is the first day I've ever belonged." He didn't answer. Just leaned his head against hers. Sometimes, fate doesn't shout. It whispers. Sometimes, salvation isn't fire or vengeance. It's warmth. And sometimes, what begins with rope and rail ends not with revenge,